Troy Jackson is now the Democratic nominee for the Senate race in Maine. He just received 566 delegate votes at the convention in Bangor. His opponent, Sandra Pelletier, received only 5. Troy Jackson is a fifth-generation logger, and he is the former president of Maine's state Senate. And before this week, he did not have much name recognition at all outside of the state. There was a University of New Hampshire poll taken before Jackson secured the nomination. It found that he has a slight lead now over incumbent Republican Susan Collins in a hypothetical matchup in November. It is an early indication that this race may be even more competitive than expected. Collins is pursuing her 6th term as senator and has spent decades cultivating an image of being an independent Republican, somebody who's willing to buck her own party when necessary, but that does not necessarily line up with her votes. She has voted with Donald Trump more times than not when it really matters. And you know what? Voters in Maine are picking up on that. I spoke to some folks, even here in New York, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan a couple weeks ago. Here's one of them. Here's what one of them said about Susan Collins.
She has a habit of, quote, being very concerned.
Concerned, always. Susan Collins is always concerned.
About certain issues. And then she ends up voting 90% of the time.
With Trump.
With Trump, yeah.
Yeah, that's her line, right? Like, I'm concerned.
Yeah. So at the point where I know what somebody's going to say and what somebody's going to do, I can judge that against whomever as a possible candidate.
And that is an exact line that Troy Jackson used in his speech today. Susan Collins has survived election after election despite that concern, even as Maine has grown increasingly blue in presidential races. And, you know, while being politically experienced is not usually viewed as a bad thing, new polling shows that a lot of Americans are craving change. There's a Fox News poll. It found that more than 80% of registered voters say they want some level of change in government. That is the kind of political climate that makes even seasoned incumbents like Susan Collins pay attention, if not freak out. Incumbents don't just run against challengers. They run against their own record, and more importantly, they run against the mood of the country. And you guys know what that is. Economic concerns and the war with Iran, all this stuff is top of mind for voters right now, and it is creating this enormous pressure for Republicans and for President Trump. And Republicans like Susan Collins have to walk a very delicate line at this point of supporting the president while also appeasing her own voters who are struggling to put food on the table all across Maine. And there's even more polling that suggests Democrats might now have the edge. Check this out. Emerson College. It's a survey of likely 2026 voters. It finds the Democrats have an 11-point advantage over Republicans on the generic congressional ballot. And that is why a state with less than 2 million residents is suddenly one of the most closely watched battlegrounds in all of America. The great Chris Jansing, MS Now's chief political reporter, remains in Maine and is watching this for us up close in Bangor. Chris, it's an exciting day in Maine.
Unbelievable. And you know what I was watching? I was watching the mood of the people as they left. And I saw virtually everyone smiling, virtually everyone deep in conversation. And you just missed it, Jacob. There was a group of union members who were singing a union song there. And I've talked about the fact that the ground game that they provide will be critical to this. But look, there was one Democrat close to Troy Jackson who said to me that what he's been through is somewhere between a high wire act and a moon landing in terms of challenges. There's a huge challenge ahead, but in many decades of covering politics, there's 2 things I always look for. One is know your audience. And if you listen to that speech Troy Jackson gave, he definitely knows who his audience is. He said, people like us, we're not supposed to have power. That resonates in such a profound way in parts of the state that are struggling, and anyone who knows people and understands people are struggling. Let me play just a little more of the point he made that really speaks, I think, to what I'm hearing from Mainers. Take a listen.
Working people, despite all of our challenges, are not powerless. You know, we're only made to feel powerless when we stand alone, and that is what they try and do, is divide us. And that's why I entered public life. You know, fought for working people in the legislature and in the Maine Senate. And it's why I'm running for the United States Senate today.
And he said to the people in this audience watching on TV and here in this room, if you have been ignored, if you have been underestimated, join our campaign. I think there's a second thing that a lot of people have been watching for, because he's coming in to succeed someone late in the game who is believed to have extraordinary political gifts. But some people can rise to the occasion. It's what folks are looking for. He gave a strong speech. He gave a speech that did what he needed it to do, which was to get these folks fired up. And I think he also spoke very strongly to the moment we're in. He talked about reproductive rights. He talked about giving people a fair shake. He talked about concerns about billionaires coming in and making decisions for people who are doing the hard work. And he talked a little bit about his own history in fighting for equality for every working person in Maine, and how his time as a lawyer really informed the rest of the way he has gotten involved in politics. Now, he has not always been successful in politics. He has not always been a prolific fundraiser. And those are things that his campaign is very aware of and that the Democratic Party is aware of. But there is one point I will make that I keep hearing again and again from people out there who are under no illusion this is going to be an easy race against Susan Collins, but who believe that he can win. It's that he has people who have wanted to get involved. The question is, can he take it, which it seems today he could? Can he grow it, and can he sustain it, which is the key to all political campaigns? And that's the challenge ahead in just an extraordinarily intense 101 days that he has ahead of him, Jacob.
It's almost crazy to think that tomorrow's 100 days out to the midterm elections. Everybody make sure to stay tuned to This Very Network, because at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, Chris Janson will be hosting a very special hour of coverage from right there in Bangor, Maine. So I'll let you go because I know you got to get ready, and I'm sure I know Chris Janson.
Really
yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to have the first one-on-one interview with Troy Jackson, and you can hear from him between 4 and 5 o'clock. I got it.
Of course, Chris Janson got the first one-on-one. I was begging just now at the end of the last hour. I said, if anybody's watching, tell them to call us now. And you know what they said? Nope, we're going to be on with Chris Janson. So you scoop me again, Chris. You're the best. Chris Janson, MS Now chief political reporter, live in Bangor, Maine. Thanks, Chris.